Hello, welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at the early evolution of the United States economic system. Now, to understand what's going on today and where we possibly could be going in the future with these social sciences, we have to look back at the past and see where we as a society have failed, where we have succeeded, what people have done that's worked, what hasn't worked, what caused problems. It's how we learn as we look back at the past, or it's how we don't learn as we don't look at the past in most cases. And so for economics, we have to look and examine the presidency of Andrew Jackson. This guy, he's quite a character. He did a lot of things while he was president, but one of the bigger things that he did was concerning the banks. First thing he did was he declared war on the bank. He hated the bank with a passion and had these bank wars going on, and it defined who he was as president, and it defined our economics for the next 70 years. He also had pet banks. These are the spoils system. We're going to talk about all of that. And then we had panic. This is kind of a crazy time to be talking about economics because we're sitting in an unprecedented economic situation with this COVID-19 coronavirus global pandemic that has shut down countries across the planet. We're all at home social distancing. This is why I'm making this video for you guys to watch, is we cannot be together in the classroom and the economy is shut down. But as we look at Andrew Jackson, I want you to think of some of the things that President Trump has done. And his first week in office, his advisor was Steve Bannon, and together they put up the portrait of Andrew Jackson in the Oval Office behind Donald Trump. And there's a few reasons for that, and there's a lot of parallels between their presidency, some of the things that they believed in, some of the actions that they've taken, and just the way that they act all together. So it's not surprising that this would be the mentor that Trump has chosen. They both have run on this populist platform, I'm running for the rural guy, the working man, I am the champion of the people kind of rallying mentality. But now that we're at the end of Trump's first term, we can actually look at some of his policies and see how they are related to some of the things that Andrew Jackson did while he was president. And I'll point some of those things out as we go along. When we mention Andrew Jackson, there's a lot of things that can come to mind. The $20 bill, his face is on it. The Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812, he fought the British back. The Seminole Wars, the 3 sets of wars against the Seminole tribe down in Florida, fighting in the swamp in the Everglades, it's all before he was president. And while he was president, he did the Indian Removal Act, which is a very dark stain on American history as far as pretty much everybody is concerned. I don't want to talk about any of that. I want to concentrate on his economic impact. What did he do to set the course of the banking system for it to get to where it is today? And the first thing is he hated the bank with a passion. So he declared war on it, and we had bank wars that started. Then, after those bank wars are over and the dust settles, he sets in a new system, a system of pet banks. And we'll talk about those and what he thought about them, the way that he went about installing them, and the reasons behind it. But then there's a series of panics that happened. They're not all going to be his policy's fault. It's going to go on throughout U.S. history all the way until the Great Depression. We're going to talk about those and how those changed policy in the future. So we're going to start in 1791. This is our first national bank. They vote to charter this because the government needs to do something with its receipts. It needs to have some sort of accountability for what is going on with the country. Who does it owe? Who owes them? They need somewhere to put all of the tax revenue that they're getting. Before, they were paying taxes to Britain. Now, the people, the citizens of the United States, are paying the government. That money has to go somewhere. So they put it in this national bank. This bank can make loans out to other banks, other state banks, or to people themselves. The huge thing it does is it funds the military, because you need to pay all of your soldiers. You have to be able to buy the different munitions and guns and horses and everything that you need to be able to have an army and keep that army, to feed everybody, to do all of that. You have to have money and a way to distribute that money efficiently. And finally, it is used to pay the national debt, because our national debt was not always, 25 trillion as of today. So that first national bank served its purpose. It had a charter for 20 years. That charter runs out, and then the War of 1812 breaks out. So there's no longer a national bank, and they find out they're having major problems in funding the war effort because the national bank isn't there to do it. So after the war is over, Congress makes the second Bank of the United States. And more importantly, the Supreme Court takes up a case called McCulloch versus Maryland with John Marshall as the Chief Justice, and it does two things. It says that the states cannot tax any transactions that the bank does. They cannot tax the federal government if the government has an institution within their state. It also says that the bank is constitutional, that we can have a national bank. So that Supreme Court case is major. We now can set up a banking system. And this particular bank has a 20-year charter as well. Now, that's going to run out when Andrew Jackson is president. So, in 1832, Congress passes a bill to extend the life of the second Bank of the United States, to make that charter go another 20 years. And Andrew Jackson, as president, wielded the veto. He did it to stop the bank. He did it to increase the power of the executive branch. Trump has done that as well. I told you I'd do some parallels with Trump in this video. He did it more for the national emergencies. He's expanding the powers that the executive branch has for national emergencies. Andrew Jackson was doing it for other reasons. The banking system is one of those. So wielding the veto is a big parallel between Trump and Jackson. So after the veto, Jackson writes a speech, the veto address, saying that the bank is for the wealthy and for speculators, and it gives an unfair advantage to people that the government wants to have in those positions. They're getting wealthy by being friends of the government, is what his address is about. So after that, he creates a system of state banks or local banks to hold all of the federal money, and he wants to put the money in there. Okay, so we've done the bank wars. Let's get rid of that. We have the panics and we have the pet banks left. Let's take a look at the pet bank system. So let's talk about the pet banking system. This is where I'm going to draw a lot of parallels between some of Trump's ideas and policies and the way that he acts as president, and some of Andrew Jackson's policies and the way that he acts as president. And the first one is the use of tariffs as an economic policy. Trump is going to do this with China. He's going to say that it is an inequitable balance of imports and exports between the United States and China, and he needs to balance it because, according to him, other administrations have been extremely soft on policy and have let the Chinese take advantage of the United States' generosity and willingness to trade and put us in a bad position. There's an argument to be had there, but that's not what any of this is about. Andrew Jackson did the same thing, except for it's a tariff on the states, and it's called the Tariff of Abominations. Now, Andrew Jackson is president right before the Civil War breaks out. He's president in the 1830s, the Civil War is in the 1860s, so it's not too far removed. We're having all of these arguments, this balance of states' rights, the slave states, the free states. If a new state comes in, which one is it going to be? How is it going to be represented? Is one going to have, it gets into a huge argument and snowballs from there, but this tariff is part of that argument and begins the talk about nullification and everything else that's leading up to the Civil War. So that's one thing they did in common. Another thing is the complete disregard for the justice system. Andrew Jackson told John Marshall for the Indian Removal Act, he said, "You've made your decision, now you can enforce it." And then he did what he wanted anyway, because the Supreme Court said that the Native Americans had the right to live on the land that they were living on. And he also did the same thing in McCulloch versus Maryland. Now, Trump has said some extremely off-color things about the justice system that I can't repeat because it's just not okay to say some of these things. Another thing that these two presidents have in common is firing their cabinet members. Andrew Jackson fired several secretaries of the Treasury, and this has directly to do with the pet banks, because Andrew Jackson set up a series of local banks, state banks, that he could put the federal money in. And these are his friends. They're his political supporters. It's the reason why he's doing it, because he thought that the National Bank was going to use their money to get him kicked out of office. So he's going to openly make all of his friends have these banks and give federal money to them so that he gets reelected. He fires the Secretary of Treasury several times until this policy actually gets implemented. Donald Trump has done the same thing. He's fired more cabinet members than any other president in United States history. He's gone through so many people that I have stopped keeping up with him. So, when Jackson set up these pet banks and finally got the Secretary of the Treasury to do what he wanted, it's what these opponents called the spoils system. And this won't be stopped until way down the line in the progressive era. So, the spoils system is basically political graft. You are using your political power, your political influence, funding in order to keep yourself in power or to make yourself richer. And he openly does this. He explains that it is what he calls rotation in office. Yeah, I can do it now, but then when you're in office, you can do it. And I'm going to give all this power and money to my friends, the people that support me. And then, of course, we talked about vetoes and how we have those two parallels as well. Alright, so we've done the banking wars. Let's get rid of that. We finished the pet banks. Get rid of that one too. Now it's time to panic! Now, what is this panic? Bank runs. Everybody is going to the bank because they're driven by fear and they want to take all of their money out. And then that causes the bank to have to take their money out of wherever it is, and then it creates a snowball effect. It makes the economy plummet, it makes inflation go up, and it makes it so that banks go out of business. They fail, and then people are just out of money. Now, this had happened before with cotton. Didn't have anything to do with Andrew Jackson. It's just an economic phenomena that kind of happens. We're learning, we're a young nation, we don't know any of this. To this day, economics can still be extremely baffling to us. What's this coronavirus thing going to do? We don't know, we're stuck at home right now. We'll find out. So, right after this pet banking system is implemented, these banks have a lot of freedom. This is what's called the era of free banking. And they can just print money. Each individual bank can print whatever banknote that they want to, so they begin printing money like crazy and just passing it out and building infrastructure with it and doing whatever they can with the money that they have, because they're the ones with the power now. Well, that increases the money supply by a lot. There's thousands of different types of banknotes and different types of currency now, and that's going to make some of them more valuable, some of them not as valuable, but it's going to increase the money supply. When you increase the money supply, you end up with inflation. It's an economic principle that we can't get away from. That's what happened. So after the inflation went up and prices started to go up, people got scared and they ran to the bank. They did a run. This began in 1837 at the end of Andrew Jackson's presidency, and there was a subsequent depression that happened that didn't end until 1843. So this is a precursor to the Great Depression, to the Panic of 1907, all of that. Just by implementing these pet banks and their out-of-control printing of money, not having any regulation on it, caused a depression to start immediately. But this sets a pattern for what's going to happen throughout the rest of history until the Great Depression. And it's going to set the stage for the argument. Do we need a national bank? Is a national bank giving way too much power to one certain entity? Or do we not need one? Is that an abuse of our financial capabilities? That is still an argument that's raging today. A lot of people don't like the Federal Reserve and want to see it abolished, just like they did with Andrew Jackson. But we had some really, really tough growing pains after the pet banks were initiated. So these bank runs and panics, they deserve a deeper look because they're such a fascinating phenomenon. Not just from the economic perspective. I mean, granted, it is amazing to see what this does to an economy, how devastating it can be, and how fear can drive this kind of action to happen. But it's the human nature side of this that is just so overwhelming and so phenomenal to watch. It's like a swarm of locusts going to attack something in fear. This is what we're doing at the banks, and the way that we were going about running our economic system caused this, and then these caused the economic system to react. And it is such a hard problem for us to fix that it lasted for a major chunk of our history. And we can break these runs and these panics down into 3 different eras. The first one we talked about, this is the free banking era from the end of Andrew Jackson's presidency in 1837 into the middle of the Civil War in 1863. And the major problem here is banks can print their own notes. They can print their own money, their own currency. They don't have anybody that they have to answer to. There's no national authority requiring them to have a certain amount of money or limiting the amount of money that they can print. There's nobody telling these banks what they can do, and then there's no standardization across the banks either. Some banks' money is worth 10 times what another bank's money is because of their reputation. So that's the free banking era. I'm sure that you can extrapolate about the Civil War. That didn't do any favors for the economy. If you don't even know you're going to have a country next month, then you probably don't have very good economic security. So the national banking era started in 1863 with the National Banking Act, and this was a lot to fund the war effort, and of course it was done by the Union to try to consolidate their currency, they're banking their accounts in order to keep their soldiers fed and keep the war effort going on. But it also put a 10% tax on banknotes to try to stop this out of control printing of money, especially now that the war is going on. That makes it so that people just start printing more money. They don't have anything to back it up with, and that devalues the currency. And so this 10% tax is a major tax. Banks don't want to pay that, so the majority of them either get a national charter and start to get their currency from the US Mint, or they go out of business at this point. They just fail. So when problems did arise during this era, account holders would usually go in and demand all of their money out of the bank. They want to take everything out. And a lot of times banks would not have the money to give them. They didn't have any reserve requirement, and if they did report reserves, those reserves could be money that they had invested in another bank. So they could have holdings somewhere else off-site and not actually have the money themselves. So when people came in to try to get their money out, they would do what's called a suspension of cash payments. When you suspend cash payments, you say, well, I'll give you a promissory note. In 60 days, you can come back and you can get your money. Well, that is going to just cause more panic, because whoever you just told that you don't have the money to give them is going to go and tell their neighbors and tell their friends and tell their brothers and sisters and tell whoever they see on the street that the bank doesn't have money to give them, and that is going to cause a run on the bank. So that causes a lot of banks to fail as these panics get worse, as people get more money to play with and there's more speculation going on and there's buying on margin and other things happening. It's going to get worse and worse until 1907. There's a major one where hundreds of banks across the nation fail. And then in 1913, they decide we need to fix this problem. We need to have a national bank, and this national bank is going to be the Federal Reserve. This is the Federal Reserve era, and it is created to stop these panics, but the worst of the panics that ever happened have happened under the Federal Reserve's watch. And there's three problems that the Federal Reserve had when it was early on before the Depression. And one of them is that membership is optional for state banks. If you don't have a national charter and you're a state bank, well, you don't have to participate in the Federal Reserve. Now, having a regulatory authority that makes rules and tells you have to do certain things, and then giving whoever it has authority over the option to play, is not ever going to work. It is a horrible idea. The other problem with it is that the discounts were way too narrowly defined. So a lot of people that own banks were trying to play by the rules of the Federal Reserve, but they were disqualifying a lot of their transactions and not giving them the discounts that they deserved. Then the last problem was that this is a decentralized power. There's 12 Federal Reserve banks, and there's no authority over those 12 banks, so then there's not any standardization within the Federal Reserve itself. So this era of bank runs and bank panic does not stop until 1933 in the midst of the Great Depression. And the idea that stops it, the thing that finally works to make this locust type of behavior stop, is the FDIC, federally insuring the deposits. So you know when you put money into the bank that it is going to be there when you take it out, because there's a federal bureaucracy that is actually insuring your money. You don't have to have that worry, so you don't have that fear, and you don't have that panic. We're going to talk about this more when we start to talk about the Great Depression and then World War II and more recent events. Well, that's all for this one, guys. I hope you found this intriguing. I always like to think about these bank runs and the chaos involved. There's a great one in Mary Poppins. There's a really good one in It's a Wonderful Life. It's a part of our economic history that has shaped some of the things that we do, and I hope now you have a little bit clearer vision of why this was going on and how we've changed a little bit in reaction to that. So next time we'll get into the world wars and the depression and how that changed our economics forever. And I hope you guys have a great day. Thank you for listening and watching, and I will see you next time.